Welcome to Book Talk. The British Conservative Party is probably the longest-lived and most successful political organisation in the whole history of democracy. It dominated British politics for much of the 19th and the 20th centuries because it had the ability to adapt, to respond to the political Darwinism that drove its great rival parties, the Whigs, the Liberals, even Old Labour, into extinction. Well, my guest today has been looking at how that adaptability works. He's politics professor Tim Bale of Queen Mary University, University of London, and his new book is The Conservative Since 1945, The Drivers of Party Change. So, Tim, can we start with a couple of examples here? Tell us about a moment when the Conservative Party in that period has actually adapted, responded, changed in a way that made it either win elections or sustain itself in power.
Well, I think the paradigmatic example really is the period between 1945 and 1951. You have a party that is beaten quite unexpectedly, actually, at that election in 1945. Labour has a massive majority. Many people can't see the Conservatives coming back for a decade at least, and yet by 1951 they're back in power. Now, why is that the case? Partly to do with policy change, partly to do with adapting, if you like, to the welfare state, admitting that there are some things they can't change, some things which they can perhaps shift.
The NHS being the prime example.
Yes, the NHS is a very, very good example because that was resisted quite clearly by the Conservative Party when the legislation was put through. But within a couple of years, they realised that this thing was not going to go away and they were going to have to live with it. It was phenomenally popular. Their task then was to contain its costs, actually. So that's a good example. But also in that period, there was a lot of organisational change. The party very much saw that its future really, at that time anyway, was to create a kind of mass organisation. And it put on, for example, 1 million members in just 1 year, or a year or two anyway.
It's one of the really gobsmacking figures in the book. At
absolutely.
one point, they were claiming 2.5 million members.
2.5 million in the early 1950s, absolutely. But also the party's phenomenal capacity to raise money, I think, really first began there in terms of raising it from its mass membership, as well as, of course, from big business. So we have a situation in which the party, in 1 year, in the 1940s, raised £1 million. Now, that doesn't sound that much, except when you convert it in today's money, that's £30 million. £30 million fundraising in 1 year. Pretty good. Not many organisations these days could do that.
So there's one example of a successful transformation, but there have been moments in the history that you chart where the Conservatives were either faced with impending defeat or actually in opposition didn't adapt. What happened on those instances?
Well, I think that's very often got to do actually with the leader, and we can see this perhaps most clearly in the period 63-64, when the debate really in Britain then was about modernisation. How are we going to push Britain into the 20th century and even into the
technology, Harold Wilson, all
absolutely.
That, yeah.
And of course, there you have a situation in which the Conservatives basically chose the wrong leader. They chose Alec Hume, who was a good man, had many great characteristics, but simply wasn't the person who could convince the electorate that he, like Wilson, had some vision for the future. So that's, I think, one very good example.
So what your book is to a great extent about is trying to find out what drove change in the periods when the party changed. And I suppose the biggest driver, as in all human motivations, is fear. In this case, fear of defeat or fear of not being able to reverse a defeat quickly. How does that fear play inside a political organisation? What effects does it have?
Well, I mean, I think you're right to point to the fact that it's often anticipation or fear of defeat rather than defeat itself, because there are many occasions, and we saw it obviously after 1997 as well, where the party can suffer very, very badly at the polls, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to shift itself policy-wise or organisationally. The anticipation of change, though, I think is very important, and fear of losing an election very important as well. A good example there is after the 1959 election, which the Conservatives won very, very easily, actually, in terms of seat share anyway. They picked up on the doorstep that there was a lot of concern beginning then about immigration into this country. And you saw there the Conservatives, from not really taking the problem particularly seriously, at least at the top of the party, within a couple of years deciding to pass legislation which completely changed the immigration regime in this country, and actually was the first attempt, if you like, on the part of the government to limit limit citizenship in this country.
And do you ever get a sense that the grassroots, the party members doing the knocking on the doors, or even the foot sloggers on the Conservative backbenches, had a role in driving this process, in getting policy to change, perhaps in changing a leader even, if necessary?
To be honest, no. I don't think the grassroots of the Conservative Party, traditionally anyway, have played very much part in changing the party. I mean, with regard to the organisation, perhaps that's slightly exaggerating. I think when it comes to small changes in organisation and also candidate selection, I think the grassroots do make a difference there, because actually the record of the Conservative Party is of the leadership occasionally trying to push the grassroots into selecting certain candidates, then refusing, and then eventually you do begin to get some change there. So perhaps at the level of candidate selection organisation, the grassroots have an impact. Certainly in terms of policy, no. For the MPs, I think many MPs would like to think that they can make a big difference. And after all, recently, we've seen, arguably, the Parliamentary Conservative Party push David Cameron into an in-out referendum. But historically, the Parliamentary Party has played very, very little part in actually changing party policy. They've got a veto on it very often. I mean, you know, they set the parameters, if you like, in which the leaders operate, because they have to think about votes in Parliament. But they're not really a motive force. The one big exception to that, and there is one big exception to that, and it's quite relevant here, is the introduction of commercial TV into this country, which happened a lot earlier than in other European countries. And the reason that happened was actually the Parliamentary Conservative Party. It wasn't Churchill, it wasn't the rest of the leadership. They actually disdained the whole thing as a sort of American introduction, didn't want to have anything to do with it. And they were bounced into it by the Parliamentary Party and a well-funded lobby campaign of MPs.
But you couldn't have ever imagined that that would be the one example of a policy forced on the leadership by Conservative MPs in more than half a century. And that's quite an extraordinary subject, apart from anything else.
No, I mean, it amazed me. I did expect to see more pressure resulting in policy changes, but that simply isn't the case. You do see a lot of policies which are headed off, if you like, by Conservative MPs, but not many policies that they actually generate. And actually, to be honest, the same goes for think tanks, the same goes for business, and both institutions which you think would exert quite a great deal of force on the Conservative leadership. But actually, when you go and look at the record, not much there. I
suppose the one example that occurs is Section 28, the law against the promotion of homosexuality, which I think probably came from the grassroots rather than from the leadership. Yes,
well, interesting. That didn't come in as much as it came from Westminster, and there was a grassroots movement behind it. It actually came from the House of Lords, interestingly, rather than MPs, and it came out of the House of Lords, and then Michael Howard picked it up and ran with it.
So we've got rid of the grassroots as a driver of change. We've looked at the role of fear, and indeed we looked at the role of MPs in all this. What about organisation? I mean, we touched on this a bit earlier. There was a brief shining moment when politics was a mass business in Britain in perhaps the 50s, where the parties were talking about membership in the millions rather than in the thousands or even in the hundreds. That's long gone now. Does organisation really matter much in the great political scheme of things? Are party leaders even interested in it?
Certainly when it comes to the latter, the truth is no. I mean, until I think William Hague, you really can't find a Conservative leader who takes any interest in the goings-on at central office, or indeed very much interest, for example, in candidate selection. And it's not until actually David Cameron comes along where you have a leader who is actually interested in changing, if you like, the public face of the Conservative Party, trying to actually modernise it in the sense of making it look a little bit more like the country. Before David Cameron comes along, and to some extent before William Hague comes along, organisation, it's just not something that interests them. They will contract it out, if you like, to the bureaucrats. Occasionally they will appoint a chairman who knows something about running a big organisation, but even that is very unusual. Half of the time, chairmen are appointed simply because it's politically convenient, and actually sometimes chairmen are appointed in order to stop their meteoric rise, and I think Ian MacLeod's a very good example of that.
So we come down in the end, really, to the one thing that makes the biggest difference, from your book at least, seems to be the leader, whether or not they're interested in policy, whether or not they're interested in organisation, but crucially, whether they strike a note that resonates with the electorate that the Conservative Party is trying to reach.
Yes, I mean, I think it's interesting. The kind of the literature and political science places a great deal of emphasis sometimes on structural change and doesn't devote much to what you might call agents, real people doing stuff. This book, I think, shows that it is very much about the leader. In big organisations like this, and particularly the Conservative Party, I think, which is quite a hierarchical organisation, it has to be said, if they pick the right person at the top, then the organisation can actually change rather more quickly than one would expect, I think. If they pick the wrong person, or a person who's not interested in making change, then it simply doesn't happen. And if you look at the leaders, you can see that sometimes even the most iconic figures actually aren't change makers. Churchill is the best example. I mean, he's up
really
there.
Wasn't interested in policy.
Absolutely, really. I mean, not really very much of a conservative even, and of course he had, you know, a liberal background, but certainly wasn't interested in organisation. Took a vague interest in policy, in opposition, not much of one, and then even in government really let his people get on with it. Whereas you have other people who are very, very policy oriented. Ted Heath is a very, very good example, and actually Margaret Thatcher as well. And although it would have been nice to overturn the conventional wisdom and say actually Margaret Thatcher wasn't the biggest change maker in the Conservative Party since 1945, I'm afraid I wasn't able to do that, because I think actually she was. She was the person who really did shake up that party and move it you know, in a certain direction, far more than I think anyone else had done. Except perhaps, ironically, Ted Heath, for whom she was his nemesis. I mean, he had as much sway, perhaps, over his colleagues, if not more sway, than she did.
And one of the interesting things here is the dynamic between the leader and the led, because it seems sometimes that the idea in the heads of political leaders is we can't listen too much to our party faithful, because by definition they're not the people we have to reach out to in order to win an election. You have to get to the sort of middle ground people who are out there. This is the theory that seems to dominate a lot of political strategy. So the key skill of a leader is to somehow ignore your party faithful and possibly even offend them without getting them so upset that they won't come out and work for you.
Well, possibly, but then you look at Thatcher's example, and I mean, Margaret Thatcher actually was very much about mobilising the activists. I mean, she shared, you know, not to use it pejoratively, the prejudices of her activists. And actually, I think that was a very useful thing. I think the Conservative Party was at a very low ebb after the two elections of 1974, and it needed remoralising. And I think Margaret Thatcher was able to do that.
And so, I mean, there's this point also about the kind of the faction that formed around her. There was a sort of Margaret Thatcher, I think Politburo is probably a pejorative word as well, but there was a clear group of people who were in around more or less each leader that you look at, a kitchen cabinet, if you like. How important are those? Are those alliances of convenience between people who fundamentally disagree, or do they kind of coalesce?
I think it varies over time. I mean, the period 1945 to 51 is often associated with a kind of new progressive conservative, Butler, Macmillan, etc. But actually, when you look at that in more detail, they're not really that united. They work with each other, but there's no sense of a project. It's not really until I think you come to Margaret Thatcher that you get a sense of the kind of project as we know it today with, say, Blair and Brown, or indeed Cameron and Osborne and the groups around them. It is really the cabal, if you like, that formed around Margaret Thatcher after she won the leadership. I have to say, it wasn't before she won the leadership, but after she won the leadership in 1975, did play a very big role. And actually, although sometimes people look at Margaret Thatcher's period in opposition as a very difficult one for her and say, well, she wasn't able to do very much, she was still having to put up with the sort of wet grandees, etc. You see, actually, she changes things pretty quickly, and she shunts these people into the sidings for the most part. She has to keep one or two of them on board for the sake of appearances, but actually she gets her key people, Geoffrey Howe being the most obvious example, into position. And then once they win in 1979, they can put what is essentially a kind of revolution in some senses in economic policy making into place.
Just time for a quick final thought. We've been talking about the Conservative Party for most of this programme, but the party that's engaged in the most obvious self-rebuilding exercise at the moment is Labour. How's Ed Miliband doing on the sort of Richter scale of party reformers?
I mean, I think Ed Miliband's clearly playing, if you like, the long game in terms of opposition. I think you have two choices in opposition. You can either really go for it and try and make change, try and rebrand the party, or you can, to some extent, rely on the government to make mistakes and rely on yourself to be a good opposition and criticise the government. Now, I'm not saying Ed Miliband's not making any change, but he's gradually releasing policies, not giving hostages to fortune. And I think actually the message that comes out of this book is sometimes that can be the best strategy.
Well, we'll have to see if you get to write the book on Ed Miliband. Tim Bale, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And Book Talk will be back again next week. Do join us then.